So the session today is Perspectives on Fighting Inequality. And we have Janice Fine, who is at the Workplace Justice Lab at Rutgers University, and Fernando Lozano, who, despite all evidence to the contrary, is at Pomona College, not Claremont College, but which is part of the Claremont colleges. So it's okay. And Colin Moore from the Economic Policy Institute. Welcome to all of you. So Janice, do you want to start?
To where I can see the PowerPoint.
Okay. So Janice, would you like to start off?
I will start off.
Okay. So we'll start off with Janice Fine. They'll have 20 minutes each, and then at the end we'll have a discussion. So welcome.
I'm gonna look, I guess, at my PowerPoint on my computer. Good. I think it's over here. All right. So am I clicking? Okay. Okay, so I'm going to spend the next 20 minutes talking about the work that the Workplace Justice Lab is doing, trying to intervene with something called the state, and try to figure out how to renovate the state in terms of how it does labor standards enforcement. So I'll just lay that out to you for a second. I believe there's an urgent need to go beyond talking about what government does to how government do it. State and local governments now have the opportunity for progressive regulatory reform, and certainly the Biden administration as well. And that we all know, right, that addressing inequality means not just passing laws, but actually enforcing them, making rights real for low-wage workers. And progressive policy can be designed in ways that create policy feedback loops that involve those directly involved in actually implementing and enforcing the law. And I tip my hat to my brothers and sisters from Worker-Led Social Responsibility, which has given me a ton of inspiration and ideas over the years that we've worked together. I'm going to focus on public enforcement, but as we said yesterday, we need not think about public versus worker-led social responsibility as Cain and Abel, I guess, or something like that, right? And we need not think about organizing versus enforcement. I'm going to argue for the next 20 minutes that you can use enforcement to drive structure back into the labor market and to support organizing. And so that's the idea here. This is the work that we've been doing in the labor standards enforcement space. And let me just remind you not to depress us, but just to much for slides. Following. How do I advance this thing? Okay, so, well, that was the slide I just said. All right, so this is the context, right? Read it and weep, right? Which is that we're at 6% private sector unionization. That's the truth. And that, even if we organize at the brisk pace of 200,000 members a year, which has not been happening in a long time and happened, I guess, in 2021, if the labor market grows at 5% a year, by 2050, at that rate, we're at about 8.6%. At that rate, by 2050, we're at, if we double it, 400,000 a year, we'd be at 8%, something like that. So unionization alone, as wonderful as unionization is, and as I come from the labor movement, I've spent years of my life building the labor movement. I still want to build the labor movement. I work at a labor school. I think we have to pay attention to public enforcement and think about how to use it to support unionization, to support other forms of organization. In an earlier life, I can't get this to advance. Why don't you just, is that okay? So can you go back 2 slides? So in an earlier life, I wrote this book about worker centers with EPI, and it was basically showing that at a time when the labor movement was in sharp decline, there was an uptick in this other kind of organizing that you've been hearing about for the last few days, right? Workers were still organizing. Okay, can you go to the next, next one, and then the one after that. Okay, these were the unionization projections. I'm happy to share them with you. They're really depressing. Next slide. Okay, so here's the exciting part, is that in the absence of being able to change federal law, which obviously is different under the Biden administration, which has been doing amazing stuff, what I call the new labor federalism has kind of emerged, right? Where we have states and cities enacting minimum wage laws that are higher than the federal level, enacting paid sick and safe time, fair scheduling laws, domestic workers' bills of rights. Now there's a lot of talk about and work on sectoral wage boards, et cetera. So cities and states are kind of alive with experimentation. And the other thing, next slide, is there's a whole new level of labor enforcement happening, right? These municipalities with offices of labor standards enforcement. This never existed before. And they're happening, yes, in some of the obvious places, but some of the not so obvious places. I've spent the last 20 years like kind of working with state agencies and city agencies and county agencies to get them to try to think beyond defaulting to just the way things have always been done in agencies. And that's kind of the promise, right? And the next slide. Oh, no, yeah, I'm sorry. Go to the, yeah. So, okay, so here's the argument too, is that these policies at the state and local level, but particularly at the local level, have really pushed against our assumptions of what labor standards policies are. They're very feminist, right? There's a lot of work family friendly kind of policy. So it isn't just reenacting what we couldn't do at the federal level. It's pushing beyond that, right? So it's broader, right? It's recognizing what's happened to the labor market. It's taking into account domestic workers, part-time workers, gig workers. If you guys haven't seen what just happened in New York City with gig work, it's incredibly, incredibly exciting. Uber and Lyft were actually charging drivers when they weren't supposed to. It was supposed to be charging consumers. And so the drivers, the AG just won millions and millions of dollars back to the drivers. And so, there's things that government does. Anyway, and then tackling subcontracting. It's kind of funny when I talk to my friends who do global labor stuff, they refer to the stuff that's government is doing as domestic supply chains, which is interesting. Next slide. So this is a flying rhinoceros. Right? Rhinoceroses can't fly. So the idea is that all this great policy is being passed, but then it's being hitched to backward, enforcement regimes. Right? So forward-looking policy, backward enforcement. We don't need that. Next slide. So I'll just say that like the fundamental problem with how enforcement is done right now is it's complaint-based. And I'm going to show you what I mean by that in a second. But the idea is that rather than seeing labor standards enforcement as social policy and a way to permanently raise standards in a labor market, most of these agencies, the vast majority of them, are just taking complaints one at a time. Connected to that also is they always talk about neutrality. And I was talking with Bob this morning and saying that I'm working on a book, and part of it is like looking at the history when state labor departments were first set up. If somebody had said to those women from settlement house movements who were anti-sweatshop, or those labor leaders who were put in charge of the first state departments of labor, that their job was to be neutral and to adjudicate between employers and employees, they would have said no. Our job is to robustly fight for worker rights, right? That would have been their response. And somehow that's gotten lost, and I want to tell you a little bit about it. Anyway, if you see every complaint as just the idiosyncratic, kind of individual experience of an individual worker, and you're not trying to figure out what's underneath it, right? And how it's, that's kind of what's been happening. Every regulatory action just begins and ends with each individual worker. Next slide. Yeah. So, and it sort of, you lose the opportunity to use labor enforcement as a mechanism to shape and mold the labor market. So that's the idea. So next slide. So systemic enforcement is this idea, right, that you see violations as possibly springing from an underlying cause, and it represents a potential signal of broader pattern of labor market violation, and that you can use it as a mechanism, right, to address these underlying structural problems. Next slide. So here's what I found. when I work with state and local agencies, right? And this is my pitch to all of us, right, is that we need our own leadership institutions. We need our own Kennedy schools, left progressive places where bureaucrats who come into government at every level get exposed to another way of thinking about what they do, right? So that they leave Lucy and Ethel behind, right? I don't know, young people probably don't know this, but I love Lucy, right? Had this great thing where the line gets speeded up, the production line, and they start shoving the chocolates in their mouths and in their bras and in their pants, and right, like, so this is what I found when I started to do it. What we are advocating is for strategic enforcement, which is a proactive approach to enforcement in which labor standards agencies focus their limited resources on those sectors that are high violation, low complaint, right? And I want to say a little bit about what I mean. So can you skip to, can you skip to slide 16, please, Nicole? Just keep going, I'll show you. Yeah, this one. So you guys, I'll just do this very quickly. So the idea is that agencies, what we find is that they get complaints sometimes, right, in high violation sectors. But there's this whole quadrant where there's low complaints, but we know there are high violations. So the first thing that we do when we work with an agency is we do like a study that shows them where we get their complaint data and we run it against the American Community Survey. It's called the morgue, anyway, CPS morgue data. These are monthly surveys that are done of violation rates, but it's worker report, right? So it's not company report. And when we do that, we can actually show agencies why their strategy is not working. And that if they're only complaint-based and they're not targeting the sectors with the largest violations, they're gonna miss a bunch. So we produce those studies, and that's sort of how we make the case to them. And then we spend time, can you go back for me now to slide 14? Yeah, so then we spend time with the agencies figuring out how to redesign. And here's one of the first things we do. After we do the study, they come with, we look at their statute. And we go through it and we say, what powers do you have? What powers do you have but you're not using? Why aren't you using those powers? And then what powers do you need to go back and get? And also getting them to realize they don't have to just accept what they have. They can go back, right, to the legislature. This is another thing. Agencies are like, oh, we can't talk to the legislature. You know, we're like, what do you mean? You got to figure out what you need. You got to build those allies and do that work. And so we work with the agencies, we train their top leaders, then we train all their investigators, and then you have to manage this system, right? It's a huge difference from how things work. So then we spend the time to do management training and programmatic stuff. But the thing that's so exciting to me is that the last step is that we bring them together with community-based organizations, worker centers, unions, and legal nonprofits, and we sit at sectoral tables. And together we develop the strategy for how they're going to go after that sector. So for example, California led in this, right? This was what Julie Sue kind of led, our acting Secretary of Labor. But now we're doing it in Oregon, we're doing it in Seattle, we're doing it in New Jersey, we're doing it in, we just had a boot camp with 4 agencies. And what we find is that you have to get agencies over this idea that they have to be neutrals. Right, to going back to their mission, right, which is worker rights, and that you can hold 2 things at the same time. You can hold, there's a natural asymmetry between workers and their bosses, and it's always going to be there until we have, you know, democratic socialism. But that, you know, in the meantime, right, that you can hold this power asymmetry at the same time that you understand you have to be fair, right, when you're dealing with individual cases. We can hold that together. And we can say that, and this is something I just want to skip to, if you don't mind, Nicole. I know I'm going to owe you like my firstborn. But if you can go to, yeah, sorry. Yeah, if you can just go to slide 35. I knew I was going to jump around. I'm sorry. You know, part of the problem with government, right, is that we don't have our own paradigm about how government should operate. So even when our own people get elected, they default to how things have always been done. And one thing that's really interesting, right, is that during the progressive era, we had, you know, we end up with like this argument for the separation between administration and politics and policy and ideology, right? And there's this idea that we should have this scientistic, easy Taylor-ish, approach to bureaucracy. But there's this moment when there's a different idea, and that's during the New Deal, right? And during the New Deal, there was this idea that, again, you could have civil service, you could have government officials who had an ideology, who had a vision, and they were expected to carry out FDR's vision into federal agencies. And as part of that was the idea that that farmers and workers should be part of the administration of these laws, right? So that's kind of the idea here, right, is how do we go back to those visions, right, to those ideas? And that's really what we're trying to do at the Workplace Justice Lab, right, is take those assumptions and stand them on their head, right? Getting them to stop just doing complaint-based enforcement, getting them to stop understanding themselves as neutrals, getting them to understand that information sharing is essential to building relationships with worker centers, unions, and community organizing groups, right? That part of what's happened historically is that organizations will work so hard to get their workers, undocumented workers, very vulnerable workers, to come forward to an agency, thank you. And then the agency won't share any information with them. And they don't, it's kind of this crazy catch-22, which is that they're saying, we're protecting the confidentiality of the workers. The workers you brought to us. Does that make sense? No, right? It makes no sense. But that's kind of the, what happens all the time. So I guess what I'm saying is I feel like we've had a critique of privatization. We've had a critique of new public management. We know what we don't like about government paradigm. We don't have an alternative. And that, again, some of my brothers and sisters in the labor movement are afraid to criticize the state. Partly that's because, some of, it's public sector unionization. But, we've had an assumption that if we do anything to change the way government operates, it's going to be worse, right? Particularly with the rise of the right and all that kind of stuff. But we have to be for a neutral, we have to be for a nimble, not neutral. We have to be for a nimble, creative, progressive, aggressive state. They know what they're for, privatization and weakening the state as much as possible. And, it was Bill Clinton who said it's the end of big government, right? We have to be for something else, but we cannot shy away from critiquing and renovating and taking on the state. And this is the work we're trying to do with labor agencies across the country. It's part of a broader vision that we see. Thanks very much.
Thank you very much, Janice, for this great talk. Next, we have Kyle Moore from the Economic Policy Institute.
Is my work? Okay, great. Good morning, folks. How's everybody doing? Again, good, great. As you said, my name is Kyle Moore. I'm an economist with the program on race, ethnicity, and the economy at the Economic Policy Institute. Again, this session is called Perspectives on Fighting Inequality. I have a presentation here, Theories of Racial Inequality and What We Can Do About It. I am a researcher. I'm not exactly an activist researcher yet, although being at this conference, I feel like I want to move in that direction to some extent. I've been inspired some. But I say that, I preface that this by just saying that, and I'm not like super involved in the labor movement, so this will be, in some ways kind of theoretical, less on the ground, but hopefully also still useful for folks so we can get something out of it. I said I could do it now. Work for a second, now it's gonna work. There we go, got it.
I can do it.
Oh, it's fine, I think it just went to sleep. Hopefully we don't go to sleep. Okay, so again, I'm gonna open up talking a little bit about who we are at EPI, and the program on race and ethnicity, and then move through three sort of questions here. How far away from equality are we? How does Econ 101 mislead when it comes to explaining these disparities that we see? And then finally, what is there to be done? Timer up here. Okay, so who we are at EPI. Again, this is my team, the program on race and ethnicity. My director, Valerie Wilson, would have been here today. And we also have Steve Martin, our research assistant, Adewale Maye, Ismael, Sid Martinez, and myself, a team of 5. We've grown quite a bit over the last few years to be 5, but we're a strong 5, you know. But EPI, what we what we try to do is try to make the case for change using data, right? We kind of have this stable of economists who do great data work and try to make that accessible for folks, make that data visible, put that in front of folks, and arm folks with the information they need to take the fight, to their local areas. There we go. Right. Again, as I said, we're trying to go back one, please. Yeah, it's a little finicky, right?
Yeah, it's more than finicky.
It might be the battery.
Yeah, I think it's.
What do you mean? It could be the battery.
Yeah, okay. I think as long as we'll figure it out. Anyway, yes. So part of what we're trying to do is show how unions are good for workers, show how unions are better for communities, how they encourage democratic participation. Again, we're trying to arm workers with the information that they need to take the arguments to the people who need to hear them. And yes, we're trying to advance progressive policies, right? Drawing attention to things like we talked about here before, gig workers, poor working conditions, and doing things like testifying before Congress, and really just bringing forward that information. Like that's the work that we're basically doing, is working on the research side to aid this movement. At PRE specifically, again, we're trying to advance racial, gender, and economic justice. We put together a few resources to be able to do this. Recently, we put together a resource guide for combating, racist policies. I think the title was anti-racist, or the guide. We called it a handbook, but it's anti-racist, a guide to anti-racist economic research and policy, right? And it had an interactive chart book, a lot of different tools. It was a bringing together of different researchers, different disciplinary perspectives to kind of tackle this question of, racist economic policy and how to improve that. It's a useful document. Hope folks can check that out. And again, Jen Shearer was here yesterday from our EARN groups, and what they do is basically partner with local groups throughout the country and labor groups to do that sort of grassroots organization aspect of that work. Yeah, and we lend our expertise as researchers to help them build those arguments. And again, part of our praxis is just trying to make these arguments accessible, make this data accessible, getting to folks where we can, talking to the media, whether that's YouTube. A lot of folks really want us to start doing TikToks. I don't have a TikTok personally, but if that's where we need to go to bring the research to folks who need to hear it, then that's what we do. But again, that's just a little bit about what EPI and PRE does. But now I want to move into just describing the problems that we're trying to think about. Again, we have perspectives on fighting inequality. It's like, how far from equality are we actually with respect to racial disparities? Again, what do we mean by this? Disparities, again, those measured areas where we observe distinct, separate patterns across groups. These persist over time in the United States. It's marked by disparities across identity, and across many measured outcomes. One example is obviously the labor market. What we have here is the 12-month moving average of the black versus white unemployment rate ratio, and we can see a distinct pattern that emerges there. It's almost consistently either at or above or close to 2. White unemployment rate is typically double that of the black unemployment rate. In and out of recessions. So this is the thing that is a piece of data that folks may or may not feel is something that needs to be explained or something that needs to be dealt with. Again, other examples: occupational segregation. Black and brown workers are more likely to work in lower paid, dirtier, more dangerous occupations. And then, of course, there are gaps in wages and income across race and gender. Again, these are an example of, where we are with respect to inequality. Another example, racial wealth gap. We just had new racial wealth gap data come out in 2022. Wealth did go up across groups, but again, we can see pretty distinct disparities across groups, with white Americans owning a much larger share of wealth, where you look at the median or the mean, than other groups, and that has been the case for about as long as there has been data, right? As long as there's data on these. And of course, health outcomes as well. This is a chart that shows the number of measures for which a group fared better, the same, or worse as compared to white folks. Again, the orange bar being conditions for which the groups fared worse. You can see that for Black Americans, for American Indian and Alaska Natives, for Hispanic Americans, there are a large number of morbidities for which those groups fared worse than white people, I should say, not just workers. And this is also, one of these persistent disparities that we see. And finally, this is the chart looking at cumulative hospitalizations from COVID-19. Again, chart is illustrative because it follows patterns seen throughout the economy with respect to race and disparity, generally speaking, with Alaska, American Indian, Alaska Natives quite high, Black Americans quite high as well as compared to other groups. And again, these are all statistical facts, right? And so the question is, once we have a hold of these and understand that this is where we are with respect to equality, what can we exactly do about those sorts of things? And that's where it becomes important to understand how Economics 101 can mislead when it comes to explaining these disparities. So I want to continue here by doing a bit of a hackneyed metaphor. Hopefully it's not too confusing or misleading, or hopefully I can make this clear. All right, so thinking about H2O, right? We can pretty well understand the properties of hydrogen and oxygen atoms, right? Hydrogen, 1 electron, 1 proton, it's volatile. Oxygen, also pretty reactive, 8 electrons, 8 protons, 8 neutrons, right? We can understand these two separate things, right? And we can understand a lot about them. We can understand also a little bit about how they might combine and what structures they might take, right? Whether it's a solid, a liquid, a gas, what the boiling temperature is, freezing temperature, pH level, all these different things we can understand about these phenomena that exist. Understanding all these granular parts of this material, neither of those things will help us understand either of these two photos, right? Again, you can study the molecular properties of water, and that has its own value, but they're not going to help you understand either of these two images. Why do I say that, right? The point of that is that the data alone is insufficient for helping us understand or make intelligible that data, and to make that data useful, right? The charts that I showed previously, these are all simply examples of what inequality is, but they don't really help you understand how they came about, whether they're something you should do anything about in the first place. And again, to be made intelligible, you really need a theoretical framework for organizing that data and building hypotheses, right? You need an environment where you can test those hypotheses, but you also need proper measurement tools, and you also need an understanding of the historical context surrounding that data. And again, so all science is social. Again, for if folks know about the American pragmatist philosophical tradition, again, all science takes place only as a process of inquiry and a self-identified scientific community, right? So you have to have a community of folks doing this work. And again, if it's a community, it's a human community, and those are all necessarily socially and historically located, right? So that's all something that needs to be taken into account when we're analyzing economic data. And again, so all science also has political economic implications, right? And so there might be headwinds if you're taking scientific approaches from the margins, right? If you're trying to understand what's happening to a group that might be marginalized, there's going to be headwinds that you face doing that sort of work. Again, power in the U.S., this is the U.S. context, founded with white supremacy, patriarchy, and capitalism, right? And so research communities that are producing work that challenges those sorts political economic power are going to be in a precarious position relative to those that don't, right? And again, so that leads us into talking a little bit about the dominant form of understanding economic phenomena in the United States right now, the neoclassical economics of race, or Econ 101, and how that helps us explain racial disparities. Now, I'm at UMass Amherst, so this is kind of like preaching to the choir here. But again, so neoclassical econ of race, methodologically individualist framework, again, it tries to explain those disparities that we saw earlier as the culmination of actions and behaviors of many individuals, right? In general, within that framework, you really just need the market unimpeded to compete those outcomes away if they are unwarranted, right? And so if people or a people remain poor over long periods of time within this framework, those people must somehow be deficient in market competitive qualities. Apply that to labor market disparities. See something like the unemployment disparities we talked about earlier. If black workers are consistently more likely than white workers to be unemployed, and the market competes away irrational discrimination as it should, then you only have a few explanations remaining, right? Either black workers lack the qualifications or skills to be employed at the same level as white workers. They lack some non-quantifiable characteristics, some soft skills, essential employment as compared to white workers. Or culturally, black workers just may prefer leisure labor as compared to white workers. All these may sound ridiculous to this group, but I mean, as folks may know, these are explanations that are, active in the field. Again, what the neoclassical framework is missing is a conception of what identity is. Again, very briefly, group-based identity is defined here as a social classification scheme by which individuals understand themselves and align themselves with others and are regarded by others. Again, identity adjacent groups like skin shade, citizenship status, all these, ideally they would be irrelevant in determining one's life chances, economically speaking. In the United States, we fairly clearly see from those disparities we saw earlier that they are not irrelevant. Again, how does that shape mobility? Again, like I said, it should be legally, it shouldn't function as a distribution mechanism. However, historically speaking, it has and does. It provides this lens through which individuals can align with groups and make political economic decisions that shape outcomes, shape their opportunities for mobility throughout the economy, right? So as we're thinking about this as a guide towards policy, we want to make it such that identity is actually irrelevant in making these and in determining one's life chances. Again, stratification economics might provide a pathway towards addressing some of these disparities and taking into account of what the impact the identity has on producing them, right? So again, one goal of political economy is to try to explain this puzzle of life under capitalism. Why do so many have so few? So many have so little, while so few have so much. Again, stratification economics takes that one step further and tries to understand why identity is a sorting mechanism in that distribution of resources. Again, it's an institutionalist, structuralist framework used to understand, again, we're trying to understand these group outcomes considering history, institutions, and economic structures, right? And again, Pat makes it serious, so and he talked earlier, so I don't want to get too much into talking about, all the different specifics about stratification economics. But it's a framework that we're using within the program on race and ethnicity in the economy to try to help us understand why the policy solutions we should be moving towards are structural rather than focusing on individual behavior. So I'll go past this quickly. And again, I'm getting to time here. I want to talk about what are the things it's going to take to get us to equality, right? Understanding this framework, understanding the disparities that we see. What is it going to take to get us to equality here? A few different pathways we can take. But first, what we need to do is change our framework for understanding these disparities that we see, right? If we get rid of this idea that the way to solve these disparities is to somehow fix disadvantaged groups, then we can actually start taking seriously the policies that we need to push forward to actually make a difference here, right? And we can understand that there are actually problems that we need to solve, right? And so what does that lead us to? I think structural, permanent policy change, not just relief structures, right? In 2021, we saw this remarkable thing happen where poverty was cut significantly, child poverty basically cut in half. as a result of pandemic-era expansions of these policies, benefit-type policies like the CTC. 2022, poverty data just came out. Child poverty basically doubled, right? Again, a great example of the fact that poverty is really a policy choice, right? And if we took a structural approach at thinking about why these disparities existed and not simply reacted to like emergency situations, then we would have maybe put some of these policies in place on a permanent basis. We could actually make some movement on these issues. Again, another example taken from that tech is probably a radical redress of past economic injustice or a redistribution of power. If we're thinking about things like the racial wealth gap, probably reparations are the only way to fully redress the full extent of that. There are reparations programs happening across the country in many cities, or I should say there are task forces that are in place, not necessarily, the programs are in place, but there are task forces in place in places like Evanston, Providence, Asheville, Burlington, Detroit, Baltimore, San Francisco. Again, I'll say all that to say that these are moving inquiries and figuring out what we can actually do about these things. And that's something that we're trying to research as well. Another thing we probably need, as we've talked about all here throughout many presentations, strong multiracial democratic labor movement. Again, so long as we live under capitalism and the majority of Americans earn their living doing wage labor, we're gonna need a strong labor movement if we're gonna do anything about inequality. And again, some of the work we do with EPI is just identifying how unions can improve economic conditions for Black and brown workers. Again, understanding the market alone is not gonna provide these equitable outcomes that we're looking for. And again, unions do a number of different things for families that are beneficial, reducing the pay gaps. We know that racial gaps are smaller for union member households. They increase political engagement. So that's part of why it's part of our practice. And again, just understanding that the case for solidarity might be complex in certain instances. It makes certain cross-racial coalitions complicated, given some of the conclusions that are mentioned in stratification economics. So I can't dig into this more. We can talk about it later in our Q&A. And again, the way forward, I think probably public engagement through policy and showing that these policies are effective throughout communities. Again, it's a lot of the work that folks have talked about here throughout the conference, engaging with folks on the ground. Because in a lot of ways, academia is bound up with structures that make it difficult to make movement through policy, through academia. Again, we can talk about that a little bit more in the Q&A period as well if folks want to talk about why just having correct theory might not be enough to move the needle. And yeah, I'll close there. Just mentioning that discrimination is something that we deal with as well, and trying to think about ways we can deal with that. And I think the best way to do that is, again, building up our regulatory infrastructure, making it such that places like the EEOC are properly funded. And so we do a lot of work to make those arguments and ensure that our regulatory framework is strong enough to protect workers, to give them recourse when something happens on the job. And yeah, and just give them a pathway to the relief. All right. And so, yeah, that's our perspectives on fighting inequality.
Thank you very much, Kyle, for an excellent presentation. Our third panelist is Fernando Lozano from Pomona College.
Okay, so while Kim helps me put my slides on, I just wanted to take a moment to really thank Bob, Jerry, Patrick for organizing this conference, to thank Kim and Nicole for all their work and all the hosting us. But especially I want to thank the presenters during the last 2 days. I found these presentations to be really inspiring. But nothing that is so good lasts for so long. It is my chance now to come and bring you a bunch of data. So, I'll be the geek in the room. So what I want to do is, and I went through 3 different decks for this presentation. First, I wanted to talk about the labor market situation of Latinos in the U.S. Labor force. And then I wanted to talk about racial inequality, and I'm glad I didn't, because Kyle did a much better job than I would have ever done. And what I ended up settling for is I want to talk about these competing narratives that you hear when you pay attention to the news, or sort of like to the large audience narrative. And it is, on the one hand, we hear that wage inequality, income inequality is as large as it has ever been, which is true, but that also at the same time, low-skilled workers, low-income workers are having new options. So for example, here in this slide, I have, if you look at the Southeast, it's an article from the New York Times talking about how low-wage workers have more options and they're better off. On the Northwest, I have an article from the census talking about how income inequality has decreased. If you look, on the other hand, at the cross diagonal, I have 2 articles about like how low-wage workers are worse now and are struggling a lot. And so I want to sort of like talk a little bit about these competing narratives and sort of explaining it in 2 different ways. The first one is that we see small differences across generations when workers join the labor force. And I should not say small. We see smaller differences across generations when workers join the labor force. But particularly for low-wage workers, as their age in the labor market, their bargaining power goes down, and we see that those smaller differences when they join the labor force just accrued across years. And so by the time that they're 50, 60, and should be at the prime of their work-life earnings profile, they're discouraged and they see like no economic advancement. And as a matter of fact, they see that they compare economy in terms of wage and salary to a worker that is just joining the labor force. So we'd see no social progression. Just to motivate my talk, this is a graph that probably you all have seen a different version of it. I did it for high school graduates and college graduates, but I could have done it for any measure of inequality. I could have done it for the 90th percentile and the 10th percentile. I could have done it for the 75th percentile and the 25th percentile. I could have done it for any measurement of inequality, for the standard deviation. The truth is that when we look at the red line, that's the earnings of college graduates in the United States. When we look at the blue line, that's the earnings of high school graduates in the United States. College graduates during the last 40 years have seen an increase of their earnings, and this is all in real dollars. College graduates in the United States during the last 40 years have seen an increase in their earnings. High school graduates during the last 40 years have seen a decrease in their earnings. So that gap has increased. And then the gray line, which is the flat line, sees the difference between college graduates and high school graduates, and not surprisingly, as evidenced by the other 2 lines, the ratio between college graduates and high school graduates has gone down. That is, the power, the purchasing power, or the earnings power of high school graduates relative to those of college graduates have gone down during these 40 years. Now, I want to argue that when we look at this line, we're confounding 2 different effects. One of them is a secular year trend, which Thea talked about yesterday in her remarks. And during the last 40 years, low-wage workers, low-skilled workers, and when I talk here about low-skilled workers, I really mean formal education, because we know that all workers have a lot of skills, but low-wage workers have fared worse in the labor force. So that's the first effect. The second effect is a generational component. Those generations that joined the labor force during the 1980s, during the 1990s, are doing so much worse than the generations that joined the labor force during the 1950s, during the 1960s, and the 1970s. And those differences across generations, that's been a policy decision that we made. Patrick was talking about bargaining in his remarks on Thursday, and about power in the relationship between workers and employees. In the 1990s, we decided to remove the power from the workers in the name of efficiency. And so these gaps, in my mind, this has been a policy decision. So let me tell you what I'm going to do. So I'm interested, instead of looking just at the stock of workers at any period of time, what I want to do is I want to look at different generations of workers and then look at their profiles during their life cycle. And so, for example, in this graph, what I have is those who were born between 1961 and 1970. These are the workers that would be retiring right now, or would be thinking about retiring right now. Again, the red line is high school dropouts. Those are the squares. And the triangles in the blue line, those are college graduates. So what I'm going to do is that I'm going to look at these workers when they joined the labor force in 1990. They're between 23 and 30 years of age. Then I'm going to look at these workers at the same time, these same workers in 2000 when they're 30 to 39 years of age. In 2010 when they're between 40 and 49 years of age. And then in 2020 when they're 50 and 59 years of age. You can see that the life wage profile of high school workers, it's flatter than the work wage profile of college graduates. College graduates, as they age into the labor force, they accrue returns to seniority, to experience, but also to staying in labor force. That doesn't happen at the same extent among high school graduates. Those returns to seniority, those returns to experience, to firm or industry-specific human capital, for some reason, high school graduates are not accruing. If instead I look at the difference between high school graduates and college graduates, which now is on the right panel. The left panel is the same data that I just showed you. The one on the right panel is showing you the difference. Again, we see that the earnings of high school graduates has decreased relative to the earnings of college graduates. And this is, again, within one generation, one group of workers that went through school, through elementary school, through high school, and everything together. This is within one generation. So what I'm going to ask you right now, and what I'm going to do now, is I'm showing you right now the data for 61, for those born between 61 and 70. And now I'm going to show you the data for 5 different cohorts. I'm going to ask you to concentrate in 2 things. I want you to concentrate on the y-intercept, the time when they join, their earnings ratio when they join the labor force. And I'm going to ask you to concentrate on the slope of that dashed line. That is the change in earnings power of high school graduates relative to college graduates. And so I'll start with people that retired 20 years ago already. And this is the cohort that was born between 1931 and 1940. We see still that when they joined the labor force, for each dollar that college graduates are making, high school graduates are making somewhere around 70 cents or so. And they lose across the life cycle, especially in this case during the last 20 years of their work lives. But now let me bring in those who were born between 1941 and 1950. And I don't know if you guys can see it. In light gray, I left the series for the 3140 cohort, so we can just compare it. And so when we compare the people that were born in 4150 with the 3140, there's 2 things to note. The first one is that at the same time during the life cycle, those who joined the labor force in those who were born in 4150 are doing worse off than those who were born in 3150. So for example, in this particular case, if I may just take a moment, the group who were born in 4150, they're going to be 50 years of age. 40 or more, between 40 and 50 years of age in 1990. And this will be their ratio compared to high school, to college graduates. If we look, on the other hand, to the 3140, at the same age, this will be the ratio. You can see that across generations, this generation is doing worse at the same age than the previous generation. And the slope is steeper, right? So even when they're ready to retire, the cohort that was born in 4150 is doing worse than the cohort that was born in 31. So there's that change in slope becoming steeper, and the change in the y-intercept, it's becoming lower. The same is true for those who were born in 5160. Now, within all the good news, you can see that sort of like that inequality stopped decreasing between 2010 and 2021. And that's why I am so convinced that this is a policy decision, because we know what type of policies can stop this increase in inequality. And I'm going to talk about that in a second. But when I look, for example, at people who were born in 5160, I see the same story. That y-intercept is becoming smaller, that slope is becoming steeper. And the same is true for those who were born in sorry, I'm almost there. Yeah, the same is true for those who were born in 6170, 7180, this is my cohort actually. And you see that now, once that we get into 71, 80, 81, 90, and 91, 200, that y-intercept is pretty much the same. But let me just highlight something that I find really, really discouraging. And that is, for example, let's concentrate in the year 2000. This is the ratio for those who are joining the labor force. So the ratio for young workers is going to be smaller than the ratio for older workers. But look how all other generations compressed are on the same ratio. That means that those, again, life earning profiles are completely flat. And while college graduates are accruing the benefits from retirement, from experience, from labor market experience, from firm-specific human capital, from industry-specific human capital, that's not happening for older workers. This is for, again, you can see what I was talking about, that once that we look at the younger generations, the y-intercept doesn't change that much, but still we have quite a steep slope. And what I want to talk about now, sort of like after thinking about the data a little bit, it's about the importance of policy. We do see that income inequality widens during this period, and there's those two effects. It's widening because of the secular year trends, but it's also widening because of within generation trends. And so when we talked about discourage older workers, now to me this is not surprising, right? We see why during the last 40 years I have seen no returns to the labor market experience. And so when we think about policy and when we think about programs, I think that it makes sense to think a little bit about which groups do we want to target. And this graph is not from me, but it's from the people from Opportunity Insights, the big team by Raj Shetty and co-authors. And here basically what they're doing is in the vertical axis, they have the return for each dollar spent in different welfare programs. And in the horizontal axis, they have the return, they have the age of the beneficiary. And so not surprisingly, when the beneficiary is young, the return to each dollar spent is going to be high because we're going to be able to accrue those benefits across their life cycle. When the beneficiary is old, the returns are going to be smaller for each dollar spent. But what I'm trying to encourage people is to revisit this idea, because this is not necessarily the most vulnerable populations. So when thinking about the marginal dollar spent, I want to think about who are the most vulnerable. So I sit in Governors Newsom's Council of Economic Advisors, and every time that we have a meeting, the governor asks us, okay, so if we're going to talk about this policy, tell me something. Who is going to be the most vulnerable? And what's going to happen to the most vulnerable? And that's a perspective that I really appreciate. So when we think about that marginal dollar, I think that not all dollars are spent the same, and particularly in the case of older workers. So Patrick talked to us a little bit on Friday about how economic theory in the 1990s sort of like created this paradigm in which we were talking about maximizing efficiency without thinking about fairness or equality. And so what I want to encourage right now is that we think about worker power and how that's reflected in the labor force. There's going to be increases in labor demand because we know that during the last 40 years there have been huge increases in productivity in the United States. But who's benefiting from that productivity? And so far, it's been capital. That's the whole thing with Emmanuel Sand's capital book. But that's a policy decision. We could have been more aggressive on redistribution. Patrick talked about redistribution of wealth, but we can also think about redistribution of income, of course. This is particularly relevant right now as we were introducing so much automatization into the labor force. The narrative out there is that machinery, automatization, and workers are substitutes with each other. And I think that's erroneous. When Patrick was telling us, sorry, Patrick, about the production process in the fields in Florida, and you had the people passing the buckets around and then throwing them around, labor and capital, there are complements. And I still think that that's very much true. If not perfect complements, at least they're imperfect substitutes. Labor and capital are imperfect substitutes. And so who's accruing the returns to automatization? And right now, it's going to be capital. We talked about onshoring. Again, we see it right now with the CHIPS Act, with Infrastructure Act. It's a policy decision. We can bring works home. We know how to do that. And the third one is about power, right? It's about collective bargaining, sectoral bargaining. We need to give workers, again, the power to sit down with employers and negotiate. And we see it right now. We have been talking about Starbucks for unionization, and we have been talking, but still, and I think it was, Janice, in your slides, like 9% of private sector workers, 6% of private sector workers are unionized. That's really discouraging. Okay, that's all that I have. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Fernando, for that. So we have plenty of time now for discussion, about a half an hour or so. So I think we'll collect a few questions and then repeat. So questions or comments? And please introduce yourself when you...
Good morning, everybody. Thea Lee, U.S. Labor Department. And thanks to all three of you for wonderful presentations. Kyle, I'm so proud of PRI and you. Really excited to hear about the great work that you're doing. But I'm actually going to go to Janice because the presentation about sort of the role of government is very resonant for me in my current position, of course. And a couple of things that I would say. One is I love the work that you're doing around strategic enforcement. And just to say that we're actually thinking about that a lot in our global work and in our conversations with, let's say, labor ministries in wherever, in Malaysia and Somalia and any country, there's never enough resources. And so strategic enforcement, targeted enforcement, but it just reminded me especially of a conversation I had with the Malaysian government around it goes to your question about the individual versus the systemic, that there were the series of withhold release orders where the Customs and Border Protection blocked the imports of both rubber gloves and palm oil from Malaysia, actually several companies, like a whole slew of withhold release orders. So the Malaysian government got all worked up about it. And I went there with CBP and we met with the businesses, we met with the government. And they're like, we're trying to fix this problem here, and we're trying to fix this problem, and we're going to make sure the workers have a passport locker so they don't have to, give away. And it was all migrant workers, is one of the points I made before. But I just had to keep saying to the government, like, this is going to keep happening. You understand that you want to bring in tens of thousands of migrant workers for cheap labor and stick them in a palm oil plantation somewhere in a very remote area. This is just going to keep happening until you have unions, which they didn't really want, among those workers. But anyway, I was just thinking maybe we can also do some of the, we do a lot of technical exchanges with DOL. We have our own issues around strategic enforcement and targeting and how do we recognize. But here's the last thing I wanted to say, which is to everybody in the room that when the government steps a little bit out of its neutral, so-called neutral role, neutral versus fair, and I like that distinction too, we get hammered. And progressive activists aren't always there to defend the government when they do that. So you all should read the DOL clips on any given morning where, there's just a litany of Republican members of Congress and the Senate and businesses with, they're very well funded. So they have 1,000 things about Julie Su, and she's the devil incarnate, and that's why she's still the acting secretary, is that the work that she did in California was a little too forward-leaning for their tastes, and the particularly the Uber, Lyft, gig economy folks went berserk. Oh, and they spent $600 million, I heard, to stop her from being confirmed. I heard that. I might have made that up, but it was a ridiculous amount of money. But I also wanted to go back to the other point about racism hurts all workers, and I think that connects over to the other presentations about how deliberate that is. And I know we all know that, that and I think that was said yesterday too by Jess, talking about that the employers do it on purpose, that they set workers against each other. Rich Trumka used to talk about this in Nemacolin, Pennsylvania, where he grew up, the coal mining, where you had the Irish and Italian and the Polish workers who didn't speak the same language and couldn't organize a union easily. And so how important it is that unions, and I love that everybody sort of talked about the importance of that role, but that unions have to overcome all the tremendous obstacles in their way, and what kinds of techniques unions have to use in order to overcome, as Kyle said, it's not just, unions face the same social stereotypes, entrenched hierarchies that everybody else in society faces as well. And just that when I was at the AFL-CIO, the kinds of measures we had to put in place to change, let's say, the nature of the executive council, or to change who showed up as delegates for the convention, we had to force people to do things that were very uncomfortable for them and that didn't seem natural. And then in Mexico, they're starting to do that too. They legislated a change in the leadership of unions has to be more gender balanced, which is very needed. But so I'm actually really interested in hearing from all of you if there are other techniques like that or things that have been put in place that have helped, in some ways forcefully, overcome the systemic racism, the stereotypes, the assumptions that people make in order to achieve more equity in organizations like unions in particular. That was a long class, but you all had me thinking.
Hi. So that was great.
Introduce yourself, please.
Bob Poland, Political Economy Research Institute. Great, all three. And what I wanted to ask about is, in a sense, in the spirit of what Thea just said, but taking it a slightly different direction and more specifically on the role of having a very relatively pro-labor administration. And, having Thea Lee as a it's kind of amazing that you have, and then if you look at the Council of Economic Advisors, 2 out of the 3 are from EPI. And to what extent that has contributed to improving, these issues, the evidence you both, Kyle and Fernando, presented with respect to inequality and the issues in terms of state and local government, and even more specifically, speaking as a macroeconomist myself, to what extent has low unemployment, relatively low unemployment, still not adequate, but we have sustained this period of low unemployment, has that contributed, if at all, to advancing the work that you documented, Janice, and in terms of the issues of racial inequality and general inequality that Fernando and Kyle that you documented? To what extent has low unemployment contributed, and therefore correspondingly the drive of mainstream economics, central bankers to raise the unemployment rate and weaken worker bargaining power? To what extent do you see that as creeping into countering whatever positive developments have occurred from sustained low unemployment?
Why don't we take these and we'll come back. Do we have anybody online?
Hi, this question is from Alicia. Kyle Fernando, wondering if Cedric Robinson's racial capitalism informs your research. If so, could you talk about how? Fernando, I was thinking about labor versus capital and a chapter in Robinson's book titled African Labor as Capital. Janice, can co-enforcement or strategic enforcement work outside of the U.S.? How would it need to adapt to, say, function in a Mexican context? What would be the first steps to take to set up a strategic enforcement approach to labor standards enforcement?
Okay, so a lot of questions. Make sure you speak in the, yeah. In the
Sure, I'll start. Okay, so to start, just thinking about the way that EPI. I'm in DC at EPI, and just how, again, folks in administration and elsewhere, progressive folks have been placed at various points of impact, I think, throughout the policy space. And I think one thing that's definitely done is started to change what the shared understanding of how the economy works is. I think, people are going around using terms like monopsony, casually, right? Like, and I think that wasn't the case, maybe 20 years ago. And I think that does open up some possibilities in terms of what can happen with respect to inequality. And I think a lot of that is you're still going to face the political headwinds that you always face when Congress changes or something. But I think it is significant that we were able to get the policies that we got passed after the pandemic, right, to stave off what very potentially could have been a serious recession and much worsening inequality. I think we learned those lessons, or we have folks in these positions who learned the lessons from 2008 and learned that you needed to meet the policy moment with the appropriate sorts of spending and sorts of policies that will stave off inequality. And so I think that is evidence that, like, there's scope for more to take place. But again, a lot of it is just contingent on what the political sphere looks like. And unfortunately, things like next year's election, right? There are lots of things that are going to shape what's possible. And I also say, with respect to racial inequality, systemic racism, that I've been a little bit less optimistic about. I mean, I think, like you said, we've seen lower unemployment, and that's been great. And the economy has been, healthy. We've had growth. Inflation is down. Disparities in the unemployment rate still remain. We just saw new wealth data come out. I think folks were able to get access to some wealth over the course of, between 2019 and 2022. Wealth went up. Again, disparities remain. I think one of the unfortunate things that happened in 2020 is that we did have this spark of raised awareness that systemic racism is a problem. And folks seem to start to understand, maybe in a different way, maybe in a re-understanding way, that, like, okay, these problems have been persistent for quite some time. Something should perhaps be done about them. And then we didn't really see much movement in those spaces. I think we did see a lot of, like, new guidance started to happen for federal administrations and folks start to do audits and things like this. But I think structural policy-wise, things didn't really happen. And then what happened after that is a backlash in the conservative spaces to the notion that things might happen. And so we've seen things happen in the courts. Obviously, you know, affirmative action going down. We've seen a lot of, and I know I'm talking too long, I'll pass the mic in a sec, but I know we've seen this movement against critical race theory, right, happen and I think a lot of that exists to kind of head off the things that were starting to maybe happen in 2020. I spoke a little bit about the different task forces being put in place to investigate the costs, the potential costs and potential benefits, like what could come from reparations programs happening at different local and state and hopefully federal level at some point. I think the anti-CRT stuff is really a means to head that off before it really, while it's still nascent, right? So I'm a little bit more pessimistic about that, but I think the understanding in the background is still being built. And so I think now it becomes a question of political power and mobilization and some of the things that we talked about earlier. But I've been talking for a while, so I'll pass it to who?
We can go.
Oh, okay.
No, go your way.
There you go. Sure.
Okay, so first of all, to Alicia online, thank you for the heads up. Actually, I should be ashamed to say that this is the first time I hear about Professor Robinson, and I should be ashamed to say that I'm a UCSB graduate. So that's double shame right now. Professor Robinson was a professor at Santa Barbara. Okay, so after my mea culpa, so going to Bob's question, I am very encouraged about what we're seeing in the labor force right now, in the labor market. I'm very encouraged by the role of the government in promoting equality, but I want to be a little bit skeptic still. I still want to. I mean, it's with. I do think that this administration has been certainly the most labor-friendly administration in my lifetime, and perhaps the most labor-friendly administration since President Johnson. And so I'm very encouraged, just a little bit skeptic about. Not necessarily about the administration, but public opinion, right? Because suddenly, what takes over the airwaves, it's this conversation about inflation or about the deficit, and it seems that every time that things start going well, public opinion kind of like gets this hawkish kind of like narrative that guides us back into sort of like the traditional neoclassical space. And Thea, I think about your question. I don't know if I'm thinking about this correctly, but I think about your question sort of like a public goods problem, where how can we create like incentives for everybody to contribute into the public good? I think that the case of Latinos is a good example because we often make too much about the differences across Latinos, and we talk about Venezuelans, and we talk about Cubans, and we talk about Mexicans, and we talk about Central Americans, and we don't talk enough about our similarities or our points of commonality. And so we were having this conversation yesterday during the reception that, to me, for example, when it comes to Latinos, phenotype plays a much more important role than nationality. And the question is, it's again, that one about public goods, right? How can we come together as members of these groups who have traditionally been excluded out of the group in power to sort of like together bargain for a more fair economy? And the challenge there is the way that the system operates. I don't know how to call it, the system or hegemony operates. So, for example, if we go again in the case of Latinos, phenotype plays a very important role. And so Latinos that have lighter skin eventually will be able to join the group in power. Latinos that have darker skin eventually will be excluded from the hegemony. So to me, it's about how we partition these groups that creates these differential markers that segregate us and doesn't allow us to contribute to that public good.
Hey, don't feel bad for not reading that book. You know that joke about two professors talking, and one says, "Have you read Cedric Johnson?" And they go, "Cedric Robinson," and the other one goes, "Read it. I haven't even taught it yet." So don't despair. Okay, so I'll be really quick. Okay, so the question of the person online. Well, here's what I would do with co-enforcement in Mexico, and I think, Thea, you're asking this question too, so I'll just say, first of all, I would choose a place, right? A particular state, a particular district. I wouldn't try to do it, comprehensively, so I'd choose a place. And then I would focus a lot on relationship building, right? I'd not only choose a place, I'd choose government officials that had some interest, and I'd be very careful about which organizations kind of had the capacity to do it. And I'd also think about what capacity building you'd need for both sides. And then I would do I'd do training for each party, but then I would bring them together, not necessarily immediately to talk about how to get started, but actually to really relationship build, but also, I did this in Seattle, like brought the investigators, the leaders, and then a bunch of the groups together, and just did like, here's some brain food. Let's think about this together. Before we got practical, first we talked, and it sort of made people less defensive. It, got people's imaginations going. And then when we started working together, it was different. They weren't strangers. There wasn't, of course, there's always going to be tension, right? And tension's okay. But there was a way that they could be in relationship to solve it. And then the other thing was, then we had them work on things like, okay, if you can't, part of what agencies say is they're so busy doing complaints that they don't have the capacity, the money, right, the staff to do anything else, to do strategic enforcement. So that meant that what we first do with agencies is we work on triage. And that's, how are you gonna prioritize? How are you gonna treat cases different? If it's one worker and they're coming for a severance check, that's different than 20 workers that are still at the workplace, that are still being exploited, and who are likely to just be 20 out of 100, or who are having that same experience. But if you treat every case the same, then you don't have the capacity to put the resources where it's going to make the biggest difference. So we work together in all the places we work to help the agency and the organizations together develop a system of triage. So in Seattle, it's actually for low-wage workers, right? That the first, that they're not going to focus as much on workers that are making, 50, 60 and above. They're going to focus on low-wage workers. And there's other criteria, but it has to do with numbers. It has to do with sectors, all that kind of stuff. In terms of your question about the administration being pounded and what do you do about that, one of the things that we talk about when we do this work of co-enforcement and strategic enforcement is saying, like, it's really important for organizations. Here's my experience with worker centers, is often the things they say outside the room with agencies is not the same as what they say in the room, and that is a problem. Right, and so we work a lot on people. In Yiddish, the word is talking tachlis, right? Like telling the truth to each other. And so, like, we really make sure that they say what they mean, and that means that they don't go public, right, with their criticisms, right? That they really try to work on it together. Now, should they never go public? No, right? Like, there are moments when agencies are being, really problematic, and then you have to do it. But we really work on, and frankly, a lot of the state and local agencies I work with, it is the worker centers and the unions that are always fighting for more money for them, fighting for more staff for them, right? So you can do both, right? You can have these difficult conversations while you're doing that. Okay, the question about unemployment and whether low employment is helping organizing. I don't think there's any question but that it has. However, I think to Kyle's point, it's not enough. Right? There has to be power. And part of our problem is we've got antiquated labor laws. We've got problems with, with well, I'm not going to go into all of it, right? But you have to have the structural tools to be able to do it, the laws you can take advantage of, and the organizations have to have the capacity to organize and the support to organize. And there has to be movement organizations that are doing that work. Like at the other program that we run at the Workplace Justice Lab is called Build the Base, Grow the Movement. And that's trying to take a distributed organizing approach, a very systematic distributed organizing approach into low-wage worker organizing, because our bases aren't large enough and our leadership bases aren't large enough. And so in some ways, unfortunately, I think that some great worker organizations that I see, their strategy is way out ahead of their base, meaning that it's not the base doesn't agree with them, it's that they don't have much of a base or enough of a base. And so that organizing is necessary in order to take advantage of these things. Leave it at that.
Okay, thank you. I think we have time for one more. Oh, I see a lot of people. Okay, so let's take a few questions, but please try to keep them short.
Jim Stanford, Center for Future Work. My question is for Kyle. I want to engage with one bullet point you zoomed over in the rush at the end of your presentation, which was very intriguing, that black workers are the most unionized workers in America, which is very important. I wonder if you could discuss a bit about why that is. It would be nice to think it's because black workers need unions more and want unions more, but given the barriers to organizing, I suspect that's not the answer. It might be more of a composition effect about the industries, occupations where black workers are. Any insight from that? And then also, what are the implications of that for the racial wage inequality that you documented? Obviously, unionization is going to lift the wages for black workers. On the other hand, I've seen some evidence that the union wage premium might actually be higher for white workers than for black workers. Again, perhaps because of occupational composition, where white workers are in unions, they are in situations where they can lift wages more than is the case for unionized black workers. Any additional info on that would be great.
Okay, Jeanette and then Leos, but please keep it short.
Jeanette Wixelin with PERI. This is a question for Kyle. You talked a bit about, or you mentioned how there are local efforts for reparations policies and also the goal of a federal policy. I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about, I know there's tension between whether or not to focus energy on the local efforts versus the federal efforts. What are your views about that? Do you see those things in conflict or as complements?
Leonce Dikumana, Economics Department and Political Economy Research Institute. Excellent presentations. My first question, I premise it by recording a statement by one of the best economists. He's no longer with us, African economist, Kandawire. He said, pro-poor policies are always poorly funded and poorly supported. And what he meant was that if the argument is that poverty is bad for the poor only, nobody supports it. Nobody of relevance, meaning people who make policy, people who lobby, will not be interested if it is that poverty only affects the poor. They are interested only if it hurts them somehow, it costs them. So in terms of the work you're doing on racism and gender and education wage inequality, what's the argument for those in the powerful camp to support the movement? What do they lose? So that's one. The second is, yes, last one is, in terms of the educational gap where the college graduates earning is rising, college higher, cannot not be seen as increasing returns to education? And what's wrong about it?
Thank you, Leo. Okay, so I think Kyle, you are on first.
Sure, and I'll start with the reparations question. I think many policies throughout U.S. history that have become federal policy have started at the state level, and the states have kind of always operated as a bit of like experimental hubs for new policy developments that we figure out what works at the state level and then take that to the federal. I think Social Security happened in a similar way. And I think that's the right way to think about the relationship between local and state reparations plans and the hopefully eventual federal plan. If you're asking my bias, I think that the federal government is one, the culpable party for, if you're thinking about reparations for chattel slavery, then the federal government is going to be the culpable party, and probably the only one with the proper means and mechanism for actually carrying that plan out in a way that's going to be to the scale of the problem. That being said, the plans that are happening at the state and local level right now are interesting in their own right, and I think what's important for those plans at the sub-federal level is that they have to be appropriate to their scope and the scope of what's possible for them to be able to do, because again, states are dealing with balanced budget requirements. They can't necessarily spend what it might cost to, address, the full scope of something like the racial wealth gap, and I don't think they should be designed to attempt to do that. But I think to the extent that they interrogate their own specific histories with respect to things that happen to people in their, jurisdiction, then they can be interesting and they can be helpful. At the very least, in building a narrative to help people get the shared understanding that, okay, this is something that can be done, should be done, and it's a question of like how to actually implement it. So that's my take on reparations there. As far as union membership goes, I think your analysis is spot on. I think there are some occupational effects there as well. But I think, one of the first points you mentioned that I think it is the case that where Black folks are able to access unions, then they do, and they do for the reason that, for some of the same reason that Black folks have in the past, flocked to like public employment and things like that, right? It's just the private market in and of itself doesn't necessarily, without help or push, doesn't necessarily provide equitable, fair outcomes for Black workers. And I think one of the reasons that rate isn't higher is because a large proportion of Black workers live in the South and in places where they have not traditionally been friendly to unionization, and that's not a coincidence, right? It's not it's sort of a circular sort of situation there. I think those places have been hostile towards unionization efforts because of what their economic model is, and because of how dependent that has been on the exploitation of Black workers in the past and of brown workers today. I think that model, one of my colleagues at EPI just produced a report called Rooted in Racism. It's used with the EARN group, Chandra Childers. I encourage folks to check that out. But it's just thinking about, like, again, the South is a place that has been hostile to this sorts of that sort of organizing. I can't remember what the last question is, so maybe I'll pass it off to someone.
If I can,
address
Leon's question. Yeah, so just to address Leon's question really fast. I mean, that's a possibility, but there's two things that make me pause about this being only an education story. The first one, if it's only returns to education, we should see the gaps early on in their careers, not increasing. So if you think that it's about returns of education, then it has to be about some sort of like second order interaction between education and labor market experience. More important to me is I think that we make too much of differentiating formal education with non-formal education. I think that all workers out there in the labor force have skills, and my first question is, why do we see these gaps in the English-speaking world, in the United States, in Australia, in England, but we don't see them, for example, in Germany or in the Nordic countries, or we don't see them. There's something more than a pure education story. Why? And the bigger question right now, and I don't know the answer, why, if it's about education and this interaction between education and experience, why is that? Why is it has to be over formal education and not over labor, and not about industry-specific capital, not about informal education? That's the first thing. The other idea that I have heard out there is this idea about deferred compensation, right? That for workers whose output is not easily measurable, firms are going to give you an increasing wage profile because that creates the right incentives for workers to elicit efficient effort. I still think that there's something more about that. For example, if I show you sort of like the same analysis, but instead of looking at high school graduates and college graduates, I look at Latino workers and non-Latino workers, I see a very similar pattern. But most important, the differences are highest among college-educated people. So there's something about what happens during the work life that we are not being able to capture with the data that I hope I can understand. And if anybody has any insights, I would love to learn more.
Okay, well, we're out of time, unfortunately, but thank you very much for a great panel. Excellent.